Story 1. Footprints in the snow. Brace yourself for the literal terror I'm about to share with you. I don't even know if this is the place for a story like this, but I can't think of anywhere else to talk about it, and I just need to put it out there. I've told everyone under the sun about this. My family, my neighbors, my friends, random news outlets. It's never enough. I can't really explain it, but I feel some weird obligation to inform as many people as possible about what's been happening to me. So, here goes. It's November of 2019 as I'm writing this. The story goes way back. I'm talking like 7 years plus. I can't tell you the exact year off the top of my head, but let's just say 2012. It might have been 2013, but that's my best guess. I was in my mid-20s with a stable job and a girlfriend who's now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I had been in the workforce for a while, and it was unlikely that my life would ever experience any drastic change because of that. There was no reason for me to move far away from home, so I didn't. At that age, my girlfriend and I had just moved into my childhood home that my parents so graciously passed on to me as my first house. It's an extremely old brick house that my dad had actually inherited from his parents when he was around 40, so I'd be keeping it in the family. The house itself has seen a few rounds of renovations, but you can still tell it's old. It's the brick that gives it away. There are very few brick houses in our area, so it sticks out like a sore thumb. I kind of like that though. It feels special. Speaking of our area, we live in a very woodsy neighborhood, so the houses are spaced pretty far apart. Our house is also the last lot on our street, so instead of bordering the woods on just one side, we border it on two. The woods back there is massive, and I mean massive. As a kid, my brothers and I would often go exploring in there, but no amount of aimless wandering ever got us even close to charting the whole thing. I'm sure some people would find that intimidating, but I've always enjoyed the wilderness, so it wasn't a big deal to me. Plus, I'm a guy who likes keeping to myself. Always have. So being isolated in my own little corner of the earth was appealing. Anyway, my girlfriend and I had been living there for a few months when all this started happening. It was sometime in the winter. I can't remember the exact month. All I know is that there was snow on the ground. It was sometime after 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, the one day a week I got to sleep in. As I was getting in my pickup truck to treat myself to a coffee, like I do every Sunday morning, I noticed something odd in the driveway, right next to my car. There was what looked like a trail of footprints in the snow. My first thought was that my girlfriend had somehow woken up before me without me hearing her, and she came out to the driveway for whatever reason. But the more I looked around, the more I realized that was impossible. The path led across my front yard and through the hole in our side yard fence, meaning the footprints had originated from somewhere in the woods. On top of that, the trail didn't lead anywhere near our house, meaning they couldn't have been created by my girlfriend. I remember standing there, confused as hell. The trail didn't lead around our house or up to any of the windows, just the driver's side door of my car. That meant someone had walked directly from the woods to my car, only to immediately turn around and walk straight back into the woods. It was bizarre. I ended up asking my girlfriend about it later that day, but she obviously wasn't responsible for it. I wish I could give you more details about that first instance, but it was so long ago that that's about as much as I remember. It must have been at least 2 winters after that when the next thing happened. I specifically remember it being 2015 because that was the year my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. I woke up that morning and walked to my car. I think it was a weekday, but I'm not positive. As soon as I stepped outside, I instantly knew something was very, very wrong. There were footprints everywhere. I'm talking in the driveway, near all the windows, around the perimeter of the house. The yard was completely covered in them. I'm a pretty level-headed guy, so I'm not going to say I started panicking, but I'd be lying if I said I was completely calm in that moment. I was already late for work, so I didn't have time to inspect the prints very, very closely, but I didn't want to leave my girlfriend in a potentially dangerous situation. I quickly ran around the house and yard to make sure no one was lurking on the property, but that was about all I could do in the limited time I had. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I texted my girlfriend about the situation, so she wouldn't freak out. I ended up leaving work early that day, mostly because the situation was stuck on my mind. By the time I got home, my girlfriend had made some shocking discoveries. As soon as I pulled up, she beckoned me into the yard and pointed at one of the trails, saying it had been bothering her all day. At first, I was confused, but then I realized what she was talking about. None of the footprints had left any shoe marks. I felt like an idiot for not picking up on it sooner. Whoever had left the footprints had been walking around in their bare feet. I was at a loss for words. Who the hell would walk around barefoot in freezing cold temperatures? My girlfriend suggested that maybe it was some kind of animal, but the prints genuinely looked like 2 human feet. We went inside and called my dad, but he said he never experienced anything like that in all his years of living in that house. He told me to grab my rifle and try tracking down whoever had left the footprints. I really didn't want to, but I knew this kind of thing was my responsibility. My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew that would be a waste of time. We had no evidence that a crime was committed, and I didn't think trespassing would warrant a search. I told her I'd call the police if I found something in the woods, and she agreed. Like I said before, that woods is its own world, so I told myself I'd turn back as soon as the sun started going down. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and headed out. I must have been following the trail for like 30 minutes when I noticed something really strange. Seemingly out of nowhere, the trail split into 2 diverging paths. I didn't know which one to follow. Hell, I didn't even know that was possible. I thought maybe whoever had left the trail had doubled back to confuse me, but then a scarier thought hit me. Was there more than one person out there? I was under the impression that I had been tracking one person this whole time. The possibility of multiple people had never even occurred to me. That was enough to shake me up, though. I wasn't fully comfortable knowing I could be outnumbered out there. I stood there a little while longer before deciding to turn around. It was getting dark anyway. As I was walking back, I couldn't help but think about those footprints. I felt like I would have noticed if 2 people were trying to walk in the same footprints. There's no way the person in the back could have done it without messing up at least once. And then I thought that maybe someone had walked backwards from deeper in the woods to make it look like there had been 2 people there the whole time. And then, obviously, there was the possibility that it was just one person who doubled back on himself. Maybe someone had been carrying another person on his back and just got tired. I really didn't know what explanation was the most disturbing. We did end up calling the police that night, but as I predicted, they told us there wasn't much they could do without definitive evidence of a crime. I told my girlfriend I was going into the woods again the next morning, but it snowed pretty heavily that night, so there were no prints to follow anymore. My girlfriend was obviously terrified, but there was literally nothing we could do. Luckily, that was the last thing that happened that winter. In fact, nothing happened for a few years after that. I would go as far as to say we had forgotten about the whole thing. A lot had happened since then. My girlfriend and I got engaged in that time frame, and we were focusing on other things. I wouldn't be writing this if the story ended there, though. What I'm about to tell you happened less than a year ago. It was just after the new year, so January of this year. One random morning, I woke up to footprints all over my property, just like that. All the memories came flooding back. My fiancée actually broke down in our bedroom, asking me if we'd ever escaped this nightmare. I didn't know what to tell her. It was actually worse this time. There were footprints leading to my shed, and a bunch of tools were missing. God knows what else those people had done. I was furious. I called up my friend Theo, explained the situation, and asked him if he'd help me. He's a big wilderness guy and a much more experienced hunter than I am, which is part of the reason I asked him for help. He agreed and drove over to my place a few hours later. My fiancée was worried sick, but I promised her that Theo and I would be able to handle ourselves. We dressed for the cold and geared up, knowing we might be out there for hours. The reason I wasn't worried about the darkness this time around was because Theo had this really expensive thermal scope for his AR-10, which would allow us to see in low visibility. I never spent that much money on hunting equipment, so I'd still be blind, but it was definitely comforting knowing at least one of us would be able to see. I won't sugarcoat it. I was pretty scared by the time we headed out. At first, Theo and I talked as we walked, but after 45 minutes, we were mostly silent. It's like the seriousness of the situation hit us both at the same time. I remember praying to God that I hadn't dragged Theo into some horrible situation. I'm not sure how long we walked after that, but eventually, the tracks once again split into two sets of footprints. We followed the one on the left for a few minutes, but at one point, the trail just stopped abruptly. We retraced our steps back to the split, and Theo made a comment about whoever left the tracks really didn't want to be followed. I didn't want to think about it, so we just kept following the footprints in silence. I'm not kidding you. There were at least 3 other dead ends that forced us to retrace our steps, wasting valuable daylight. I remember thinking how remarkable it was that someone could walk backwards so perfectly that a trail of footprints didn't look like it had been stepped on multiple times. I'm telling you, it wasn't normal. The one upside, which Theo pointed out to me, was the dead ends likely meant we were tracking just one person. Eventually, it started getting dark. We were really deep in the woods at that point. I didn't recognize my surroundings at all. The trail footprints didn't diverge for a long time after that. Theo said whoever we were tracking had probably given up trying to make dead ends. Another 5 minutes or so passed, and the footprints started getting noticeably deeper. We were getting closer. At one point, another set of footprints appeared right alongside the original. Theo cursed and whispered that he had been wrong, and that we were probably tracking 2 people. The sun was basically all the way down now, so Theo was checking his scope every so often. The snow gave me some visibility, but I'll be honest, I probably would have turned around had it not been for Theo's scope. We were walking in complete silence. Out of nowhere, I felt Theo's arm reach against my chest, motioning me to stop. I looked at him, and he was looking straight ahead through his scope. I couldn't see what he was looking at, so I just kept looking at him. It looked like he was holding his breath. I had never seen him so still. After a good 20 seconds, he slowly made his way over to the nearest tree and crouched down. I followed suit, not even questioning why. He looked through his scope again, and I could see his hand begin to tremble slightly. Another 20 seconds of complete silence. I was dying of suspense, so I lightly tapped his shoulder. He lowered his rifle and silently handed it to me. I looked through the scope and had to fight back a scream. There were 4 figures huddled in the snow. At first, I thought they were bears, but I quickly realized they weren't. They were human beings. 2 of them were large and hunched over, and the other 2 were smaller. The smaller ones were clinging to a nearby tree, wildly jerking their heads around. They were eating something. I couldn't make out faces or details. Thermal scopes don't give you that. But I could see enough to know they were naked. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen with my own 2 eyes. Eventually, the larger ones picked up the smaller ones from off the tree and placed them on their shoulders. They then began walking deeper into the woods. Theo and I sat under that tree for what felt like an hour. We didn't dare move until we were positive that there was no way those things could hear us. By the time we got back to the house hours later, I was surprised to find my fiancée was still awake. She told me she couldn't sleep knowing I was out there and asked what we found. I told her in as minimal detail as possible, but she was still horrified. We called the police that night, who told us they'd search the woods the first thing the next morning. Theo agreed to stay the night so the 2 of us could assist the police in their search. The next morning, the police searched the woods with our help, but called it off after a few hours due to the partly covered-up footprints. My fiancé demanded that they keep searching, but they said they couldn't sanction a huge search over some missing tools. I don't blame them, but it didn't feel like closure. Theo, and I knew what we saw. Winter's fast approaching, and both my fiancée and I are worried those people are going to come back again. We're seriously considering moving but haven't been able to get the ball rolling on that. I don't really know what to think. Like I said earlier, I've told everyone I can about what's been happening to us. It's literally been going on for years. None of my neighbors have ever experienced anything like this, which doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why my house is getting targeted or what those people even want. Some of my friends think they're harmless, but other people tell me I'm in grave danger. I think I'm going to try and seal off my yard from the woods, but I don't know what else to do besides that. Hopefully, we can move out soon. Story 2. Terror over the airwaves. I apologize in advance if I mess up any details about the story I'm about to tell. This is something that my best friend told me multiple times several years ago now. It's one of those stories so unsettling you can't shake it, even after hearing it more than once. My friend's dad was a logger, specifically a tree saw operator. For those who don't know, a tree saw is a massive machine capable of cutting down giant trees and slicing them to specific lengths. His job meant long, grueling hours, often alone in the deep, secluded forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew worked, he was paid based on the number of trees he cut down, rather than the hours he worked, so he would often push himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs as quickly as possible. After he and his coworker finished their part, the rest of the crew would come in to clear the felled trees and transport them to the mill. While he spent about half of his time working alone, the other half was spent with his friend Griffin, another tree saw operator. They used radios to communicate, especially when they worked on opposite ends of the same job site. A number of years ago, my friend's dad and Griffin were assigned to a remote job site high up on a mountain. It took the company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment to make it to the site. By the time they began work, they were positioned in an extremely desolate part of the mountain. They were already 10 days in, making good progress, when they started hearing strange chatter over their radios. At first, the voices were muffled, just faint, static-laden murmurs that didn't make sense. They tried switching channels, but no matter what they did, the chatter followed them. Anyone who's used a standard radio knows how strange that is. It should be impossible for anyone to follow you when you're switching channels. As they progressed farther up the mountain, the voices became more distinct. They couldn't hear full conversations, but based on what they could hear, they both agreed that the tone of the conversation fragments felt off. My friend's dad said it sounded almost casual at times, but the content was unintelligible. They also started finding strange signs that people had been there before them. Random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift campsites. Like I said before, they were in a place so remote it was practically inaccessible, so these discoveries were deeply unsettling. No one should have been up there. One day, Griffin came across a tent hidden just off a trail and called my friend's dad over. They decided to investigate. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with the most disturbing things imaginable. Multiple pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches of children being molested. There were even photos of a fresh apple, indicating whoever owned it had been there recently. Griffin wanted to pack up and leave immediately. My friend's dad, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish the job. They agreed to limit radio communication to emergencies only and decided to keep working. That night, they sat in the camper, unable to shake the dread that hung over them. The radio crackled to life again, and this time, they could make out snippets of a conversation between two men. They were talking about mundane things, collecting water and firewood, but the realization that these men were likely connected to the tent freaked my friend's dad out. Griffin wasn't as fazed, but my friend's dad was losing it. The next night, my friend's dad decided to confront them. When he heard the men talking about gathering brush for a fire, he grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. The radio went silent immediately, and the men didn't respond. That silence was almost more unnerving than the chatter. Griffin was upset that my friend's dad had announced their presence, and the two of them got into a brief argument before deciding they'd escalate the situation. The next day, around midnight, Griffin shook my friend's dad awake, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he noticed was the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Heart pounding, he fumbled for his gun, only to realize it wasn't loaded. He had no idea where his ammunition was. Griffin was unarmed, and the idea of calling the police was laughable given their location. They both sat frozen as they heard the camper door handle jiggle. The door creaked open but didn't fully swing inward. Their camper was high off the ground, and there was no ladder or stool to climb up. Then came scratching, long, deliberate scratches along the outside of the door. 4 agonizing minutes passed. Finally, my friend's dad nodded at Griffin, signaling he was going to check it out. He moved quietly toward the door, gripping a flashlight in his shaking hand. Just as he reached the door, it burst open, and he was struck across the face with a knife. The pain was blinding. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. Before he could recover, a man was on top of him, pressing the knife against his neck. Another man appeared, kicking him repeatedly in the head. Griffin, without hesitation, leaped out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second man bolted into the darkness, and the one Griffin had tackled scrambled to his feet and followed. They disappeared into the forest. Griffin helped my friend's dad back into the truck, and they drove 2 hours to the nearest hospital. It was bad. His face was a bloody mess, and there was a cut across his eyes so severe it permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their coworkers was found bound, gagged, raped, and murdered in a ditch. No arrests were ever made. To this day, my friend's dad struggles with PTSD. His right eye, with its disfigured pupil, constantly reminds him of that night. I'm sure he hasn't had a full night of restful sleep since. I've been terrified of deep woods for a long time now, mostly because of my friend's dad's experience. I haven't heard from my friend or his dad in years now, so I can only hope he's doing all right. Story 3. The Phantom Thief of the Woods. Last summer, I decided to tackle a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back over the course of a little more than a week and a half. It sounded straightforward enough at the time. The first few days went smoothly, about how I expected. The trail was everything I'd hoped it would be. Endless stretches of towering trees and winding paths cutting through serene landscapes. I'm in pretty good shape, so I don't have to stop very frequently when I'm hiking. I'm obviously not going to hike in the dark, though, so every night I had to pitch a tent to get some shut-eye. I've always preferred to keep a low profile, especially since solo hikers can attract attention. Because of that, I'd venture a little off the trail to set up my camp each night. I figured it was better that way, minimize the chance of a stranger stumbling across my campsite. Up until the third night, everything was perfectly fine. But what I'm about to tell you is the reason why I'm taking an extended break from hiking, or any kind of wilderness exploration, for that matter. I woke up in the middle of the night with this odd sense that something was wrong. It was the kind of gut feeling you can't explain, but you know better than to ignore. I looked around my tent. Everything seemed normal inside, so I decided to have a look around the campsite. I drew my rifle, grabbed a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. There was no one out there, no one that I could see, at least. I returned to my tent and started checking my pack. That's when I realized my wallet was gone. At first, I thought I'd just misplaced it, maybe left it outside the tent or buried it somewhere in my gear. But after tearing through everything, it was clear someone had taken it. My personal information, cash, credit cards, all of it. How is that even possible, though? Had someone broken into my tent just to steal that one thing and leave? It was unlikely, but randomly misplacing it was very uncharacteristic of me. I came to terms with the unfortunate conclusion that I had probably lost it myself. Things only got worse from there, though. Over the course of the next few days, I started to notice more things missing. Small items, seemingly random things. One of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew I wasn't just misplacing everything. Someone was stealing my belongings. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but by the fourth day, it was undeniable. I was being stalked. There wasn't any cell coverage on that part of the trail, so it wasn't like I could alert someone about my situation. I remember contemplating turning back, but I'd only be saving myself a couple of days at best. There was no way I'd be able to hike either direction without sleeping, but I didn't feel comfortable pitching a tent in those woods with someone literally stalking me. It was a lose-lose situation. I remained calm and told myself there was a reason I had brought my rifle out there. And then it dawned on me. Why hadn't that person stolen my gun? It's almost as if they were deliberately messing with me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping that would keep them out should they return. I tried to stay up for as long as possible, but I eventually fell asleep from pure exhaustion. My plan worked, though, because when I woke up the next morning, there was no sign that anyone had been in my tent. By then, the paranoia had set in fully, though. The solitude was getting to my brain, and every second of hiking was agonizing. I don't have anxiety, nor have I ever had it, but let me tell you, I have never felt worse in my life than I did over the next few days. Just imagine being in my position. No options but to continue hiking despite knowing someone's lurking not far behind. The anxiety was perpetual, and I was unraveling. I can't explain why or how, but my mind started playing tricks on me. A rustling in the bushes turned out to be nothing. A shadow flickering at the edge of my vision vanished the moment I turned my head. The hallucinations got worse. I can't remember most of them specifically, but the one that sticks out the most is this. As I was walking, I felt myself step into an ankle-deep puddle of water that almost caused me to trip. I literally heard the splash and felt the cold water soaking my sock, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in complete shock. It felt so real. I had no choice but to continue down the trail. As bad as the days were, the nights were always worse. I tied my tent shut and slept next to my rifle, but nothing made the anxiety go away. At one point, I had to splash cold water on my face to calm myself down. The hallucinations mostly subsided after that. I'm not sure what I would have done if they had continued. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps walking around my campsite. I quietly grabbed my rifle, preparing to confront whoever was there, but my body was frozen in fear. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but there was no way in hell I was going to sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up camp in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my gear. I couldn't stay out there another night. I was so close, probably a day and a quarter's hike away from my car, maybe less if I moved quickly. I decided that I wouldn't be stopping to sleep that night, that I'd push through the night to get off that godforsaken trail as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours as quickly as my body would let me go. When the sun started to set, I gritted my teeth and continued instead of pulling off to pitch my tent. By the time it was pitch black out, I was so close, probably 2 hours away at most. I kept walking, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. I started second-guessing my decision. I had never hiked in the darkness before, and I was not prepared for how difficult it was. That, in and of itself, was scary enough. I kept going, trying to keep my breathing steady. About an hour passed. I was getting closer. And then I heard it, somewhere behind me. I was sure I heard footsteps. I spun around and flashed my light, and to my horror, I saw something slink behind a tree. The adrenaline took over, and I aimed my rifle at the tree. I demanded that they come out in a loud voice. The figure stepped forward. It was definitely a human. But when I tell you it was the most barbaric-looking thing I'd ever seen, I'm not exaggerating. Words cannot describe what I was looking at. He was wearing nothing but a pair of my shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was scratched up in several different places, and his face was covered in hair. He started walking towards me, even though I had my rifle aimed at him. Before I could think, I tapped off a warning round next to him. He jumped at the sound and instantly retreated, sprinting back into the woods. I was in shock. Without wasting another second, I turned around and went as fast as I could. By the time I made it out of the woods, I locked my car doors and called the police. When they finally showed up, they told me that I shouldn't stick around. I didn't need to be told twice. I was out of there that night. The craziest part of the whole thing, in my opinion, was the hallucinations. I didn't think such vivid hallucinations were even possible. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and I can confidently say that when I do, I won't be alone. I would advise anyone planning on hiking the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely cautious and carry a firearm. This experience is something I still think about often.